Throughout the Boston mayor's race, John Connolly and Marty Walsh have worked diligently to woo voters in Boston's communities of color. Take Connolly's first TV ad, in which an African-American child and a Latina mom touted Connolly's efforts to stop Boston's schools from serving spoiled food.
How can you ethically feed that food to children? It's disgusting.
On the stump, Walsh has stressed his inclusivity, too. And he's racked up a spate of endorsements from African-American and Latino politicians, including his former rival, Charlotte Golar-Ritchie.
The band is back together.
I believe Marty can lead our city, and that his vision is going to be closely aligned with that of my own and that of every one of my supporters.
And when both candidates were asked in their final debate about racism in the Boston Police Department, they agreed that the problem is actually much bigger.
There's racism in all of Boston, institutional, systemic, structural racism.
We talk about one Boston, and we don't see one Boston today in the city of Boston.
Proof that whatever the color of the mayoral finalists' skin, Boston politics have come a long way.
I'm joined now by Marcela Garcia of Telemundo Boston and Wesley Lowry of the Boston Globe. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So we hear over and over the mantra that communities of color are not a monolith, that they don't all vote together. But how significant do you each think that this backing by everybody from Felix Arroyo to Charlotte Golar-Ritchie, John Barros, how significant is it, Marcela?
I think in the Latino community anyways, or talking about the Latino community in particular, I don't think these endorsements are going to carry on in a big way towards the final next Tuesday. I think people are supporting either one, like, you know, the 50-50 in the Latino community. There's some supporters of Felix Arroyo that went to support Connolly, and likewise with Walsh. So I don't think there's any overwhelming support for one or the other, so the endorsement may not have come a long way.
We should also point out that the Bay State Banner endorsed John Connolly. So
yeah, definitely. I mean, it hasn't all been one way. And John Connolly's also picked up the endorsement of several, community leaders of color, ministers of color. But I do think there is some power in numbers here. So it's very easy. We often default to saying, endorsements are overblown. They don't really matter as much. But I do think if you live in Dudley Square and every single leader who you voted into the office has endorsed Marty Walsh, or John Barros going back for years, and he's someone who you supported for mayor. Maybe you would personally prefer John Connolly, but when John Barros shows up at your doorstep, which he has been doing, which Felix has been doing, which Charlotte has been doing, it makes you give them another look. It makes you give them a second look. And I think that might be the effect in many of these communities of color, is that voters who, one, may not have shown up at all in the general election because their preferred candidate got knocked out, or two, might have been leaning one way or the other. I think they might give a candidate like Marty Walsh a second look.
It's interesting because some of the other candidates in the race who are non-minority candidates have not endorsed, and you wonder if the same kind of tactic would work in white neighborhoods. And my guess is probably not, that it's more effective. And why is that?
Well, I think that communities of color really take into consideration who's there at their front door. And we were just talking about, for example, in Spanish language TV, John Connolly hasn't advertised, whereas Marty Walsh has. And I think that may make a bigger difference, that maybe the endorsement among the Latino community, because people do really care about that, who's at their on their TV set, and that I think may make a difference as well.
Of course, there's an importance in underrepresented communities and in the voters feeling like you show up, that you've been there, that you've reached out to them. And in fact, I do think that might in some ways be a strength for John Connolly, who as a citywide councilor has held hearings in a lot of these communities. They've seen him before. He's, as he mentions all the time, his daughter goes to school in Dorchester. I mean, John Connolly is not a stranger to a lot of these communities. And in fact, out on the trail, I'm with him in Roxbury maybe 2-3 times a week. So he has spent a lot of time there. Marty has certainly spent a lot of time there as well. But there is, when you're talking about communities who might not otherwise be heavily engaged in this election or any municipal election, there's a lot to be said for the voters feeling like you show up, and you show up not just at election time, but that you've been there. And that's what some of these endorsements carry with them, is maybe we haven't seen Marty Walsh in our neighborhood all the time, or maybe we haven't seen John Connolly in our neighborhood all the time, but we've seen Sonia Chang Diaz, we've seen Tito, we've seen Carlos Enriquez, and so therefore since they are so convinced this is the person, maybe I'll take that into consideration.
What are people buzzing about, though, in communities of color about the issues? I mean, is education still the big thing? Is it crime-related things? What is it that people really, jobs? What is it?
It's jobs, it's education for sure. One thing among Latinos is that Latinas, Hispanic women, were responding very well to John Connolly. Remember that generalization that mothers or women in particular were responding very well to Connolly? Well, that was also felt in the Hispanic community, and that may be because of his schools and education background. So that tells you that they care about the schools, they care about the children, they care about public safety, they care about immigration. Believe it or not, there was a forum last night on immigration issues with two of the candidates, and it was put together by this coalition of immigrant groups, Vietnamese, Chinese, Brazilians. It was right in the middle of Dorchester in a Vietnamese center. So that tells you that there's this, not it's the typical issues as any other voter.
Exactly, and access to resources I think is a big thing, no matter what that resource is, whether that's in terms of quality of schools, whether that's quality in terms of public safety and livelihood, whether that's transportation, which you see a lot of communities that are dominated by minorities don't have the same access to transportation or even to cab services or transportation. These issues in these places can be huge often, and so I think that that's something that a lot of minority communities and a lot of minority voters are looking for is, again, and that's often why I think sometimes we think and expect them to back minority candidates, is because it's the idea of, does this candidate understand this experience? Have they been there? And will they be a real advocate in City Hall?
What's your sense, Wesley, about certain neighborhoods being motivated to vote on their own, or are they going to have to, wait for the Marty Walsh campaign to come and pick them up and give them rides?
I think generally, I think this is going to be a relatively low turnout race. I don't think that the electorate as a whole, and again, not just minority voters, any voters is really, really cued into this, is really paying attention to it. We haven't gotten any indication of that. We had a relatively, we had okay turnout prelim, but nothing exciting, nothing to write home about, and I expect it to be similar. And certainly for it to be similar in neighborhoods where neither the candidates are from, where they don't draw their traditional power bases, and in Boston, that is a lot of the minority communities. John Connolly's not from those communities. Marty Walsh is not necessarily from those communities, and so a lot of them have less skin in the game, per se.
What do you think?
I think, for example, in the casino, in the East Boston area, where the casino issue has been very, very important and a heated argument, I think that may make a difference in turnout. People may not necessarily come to vote for a mayor, but the casino issue they will, and that's probably going to help Connolly, because he won East Boston anyway.
Do you think the council vote is going to bring people out in certain neighborhoods? Or not?
Probably, I think so. There's a lot of support in immigrant communities and minority communities of color for Michelle Wu, for example. She has totally energized that base. So I think so. I think it might make a difference.
That's true as well as in District 5, where you now, because of the redistricting, a chance to have a second person of color, a second black council member at the district level. So that could potentially mobilize some of these communities as well. But again, I do think that will be a factor, and I certainly think the East Boston casino vote is going to be a large factor that does help John maybe a little bit more than it helps Marty. But again, I'm just still not convinced we're going to have a great turnout. I think the day after the election, we're all going to be talking about how no one showed up to vote and why does no one care and what's going on.
Still.
Exactly.
Let's hope you're wrong on that.
I hope to. I hope so too.
Leslie Lowry, Marcela Garcia, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Of course, thank you.
All right, well, that is it for Greater Boston. Tomorrow it's Beat the Press. John Henry pens a 2,800-word open letter to the Boston Globe readers, but it's what he didn't say that has some critics talking. Plus, seeking celebrity opinion, the Wall Street Journal has to clean up after Suzanne Summers and her nutty op-ed. That and more tomorrow at 7. I'm Emily Rooney. Thanks for watching.
Tell your story.